the socialite who went to an elegant dinner and left with a man who would make her disappear from the world she knew. I tell people I went for the lights. It sounds prettier than the truth. I went because on nights like that, the city is a polished mirror, and you can pretend the cracks don't show. You can float through a room of well-dressed strangers and be admired for nothing more complicated than a dress and a laugh. The gala was one of those windows. Crystal chandeliers, the scent of citrus and amber candles, men in tuxedos who said the right names, and women whose smiles were calibrated. They filmed the first hour. They wrote about the horseshoe of pearls at table 7. They took my photograph with a string of patrons who made a show of donating. I stood at the edge of that glossy river and felt like a person everyone expected to sparkle. They had called me a fixture at charity circles, a woman who knew which causes needed money and which dinners needed a familiar face. It was comfortable, in the way a cage is comfortable once you learn the pattern of the bars. It paid the bills, it bought the nights I sometimes wanted to forget, and it hid the slow ache I had learned to tuck beneath stage makeup and laughter. Rain began later, as on cue. A thunderhead rolled in over the bay, and the light in the ballroom dimmed to something more cinematic. People did the polite shuffle to the lobby, where cars waited under the valet lights. I stepped out into the cold air with my shawl, like every other polished woman, and the raindrops landed on my lashes, and the world became small and immediate. Umbrella kits, the slap of water on pavement, the distant hiss of tires. He was under an umbrella by the curb, one hand in the pocket of an overcoat that looked like it had been cut for midnight. He was not the man the room would have expected. They would have expected the familiar kind, the entrepreneur whose name appeared in charitable panels and whose donations were made with matched checks. Dante Moretti sounded like a headline you read in italics, the kind you pinned to gossip. But here he was, raw against the rain, like he'd stepped straight from the center of a different life. The first thing you notice about him is the way people look away. The second thing is the way music seems to slide down and hush. He didn't move like a man making an entrance. He moved like a thing that was used to being noticed without trying. His cheek had a long, lighter scar that split a dark slope of beard, something jagged and personal. His cologne smelled of sandalwood and something green underneath it, like a memory of pine. He smiled with half his face, and in the curve there were private jokes and old violence. "You look wet," he said. He did not offer a hand. He offered an observation that landed between us like a small, precise object. "I'm fine," I said, because at that moment I was very practiced at fine.
I took 2 steps toward the car that had a driver waiting, and then a movement. It may have been a bodyguard, a man whose jacket suggested purpose, closed the space at the rear of the car. It was the sort of choreography practiced for other men, for other women, the way the world folded around people like him. For a second I felt the old flip of panic, the recognition that sometimes being seen meant being chosen. He leaned across the umbrella, and for a second the rain and light and the hum of the city made the world press tight. "You shouldn't go alone," he said. There was something in the words that was not a suggestion. I bristled because my life had been built partly on doing things for myself, but the sound of his voice had a gravity. I did the sensible thing for a socialite in a wet gown on a busy curb. I laughed it off. "Are you offering a ride?" He looked at me like the question had amused him. "No," he said, "I'm offering protection." The laugh died. It wasn't a joke. Men carrying the last echoes of gunmetal in their eyes stood near the valet trucks. 2 of them wore the same expression, waiting for a command. The driver of my car touched his wrist, and the signal died out. The world rearranged itself, polite people becoming extras on a stage I hadn't agreed to join. "You're being watched," Dante said, and his voice was small in the storm. He didn't tell me who. He didn't have to. The name that passed behind his teeth, between us, private, was enough. I heard something else under the syllables, the history of eyes all around me, the way cameras can fold distance until everything you are is a surveillance feed. "By who?" I demanded. "By people who would prefer you weren't seen with me," he said, "or by people who would prefer you weren't seen at all. There are things you can say on a curb with rain in the air that feel very much like truth, and others that feel like a threat in a velvet glove." He said both. "Then come and sit with me in my car," I told the devil on the curb, "or call the driver, or call the police." He smiled without humor. "There's not enough time for that." He slid a card into my hand, because politeness is a language even cruelty sometimes speaks. The card was heavy and black and had his name in silver script. No title, no company, no benevolence in the way the others had. His fingers brushed mine. The contact was insignificant and entire. The decision, leave with him and accept a week of something I couldn't name, or step into the scolded shower of watchers and remain alone, arrived with the clarity of a coin flip. I remember thinking, absurdly, about the photographer in the corner of the ballroom who would probably angle this into a scandalous image by morning. He would photograph the curve of my jaw, the way the umbrella bent. He would write something neat about men and women behaving like fireflies. What happens if I say no? I asked. He tilted his head. Then you'll be watched, you'll be safe from nothing.
Or you'll be public, and people who like to use reputations will look for a way to hurt you. They'll find a moment. He named all the things that end up in columns: scandal, broken reputations, the way a woman can be weaponized by proximity. Or you can come with me. For 1 week. A week of protection. Full hospitality. No explanations, no press. 1 week. 1 week to what? To decide, Dante said, whether I'm worth staying for. It was a ridiculous line. It was a promise he did not have the right to make. He said it with enough gentleness that for a moment I almost believed him. For a moment I imagined a week as an island, a week of privacy, of food cooked by someone else, of not being picked at by the city. For another, wiser moment, I remembered the men near the valet and the way his shoulders were set, how his eyes tracked the periphery as if he owned the space outside the umbrella. You can't tell me I'm your thing and expect me to... My voice trailed, because there are truths that sound naive when you attempt to say them under an elegant chandelier and the rain, when you say them with the press of paparazzi and other worse watchers. You don't get to make that decision for me. He didn't answer for a long beat. He put the umbrella against his shoulder as if he were shielding the rain from his coat, and not because he wanted to shelter me. I don't want to make it for you, he said finally, but there are people who will do worse than me. If you let me take you, not as possession, but as a barred door between you and them, then I promise you 1 week. After that, you leave. The absolute clauses in his promise did not sit right. There was the scent of manipulation in his vow, a desire to assert that his way was the only way. It was a control that came wrapped in concern. When you are in the frame of a camera, when your life is a polished image, the world reduces your options down to 2 colors, the one you are allowed to be and the one you will be shamed into. On the curb, with rain like fine sand, I chose the unpretty survival option. I told myself I was reasoning. I had a body and a life that could be punctured by people who do not mind staining reputations with violence. I told myself that a week could be endured. I slid into his car with the buttoned-up driver and the man with the scar sitting beside him in the passenger seat. Marco, a man whose job had been to be obdurate, who nodded to the driver with the efficiency of someone who had seen too many minor catastrophes to gossip about a woman getting into an unfamiliar vehicle. My phone buzzed with a photograph of me leaving, a casual friend texting a heart emoji and a caption that said, "Jealous?" A minute later, the texture of the world changed. I did not see the city. I saw only the tightness of the interior, the scent of leather, the hum of a machine that was designed for privacy. We drove through rain that smeared streetlights into watercolor.
Dante's hand rested on the back of my seat, a fraction of an inch from my shoulder. It was not touching, and the absence felt like weight. He spoke once, in that close voice that felt like it belonged in a house rather than a car. You should know. There are things I will do that will make you think I'm monstrous. You have the right to be horrified. You have the right to leave. What things? I asked, because I wanted a list I could measure on my palms. Things for which you'll likely hate me. Things that were words before they were hands. His jaw hardened. Actions I took to protect people who've gone missing. People whose mothers were killed standing at bus stops. I can tell you I'm not proud, but I will tell you I'm cautious. I felt differently about a man who could name his control and call it caution. The phrasing tried to frame violence as a defensive instrument, as if a saw could be called a tool in a workshop for the same reason a scalpel is a tool in an operating room. I didn't want to romanticize what he said, but I also wanted to be alive to the fact that he had offered me an option and he had admitted a capacity for darkness without sugarcoating it. The house he took me to was not the corporate sterile mansion people picture in magazines. It sat back from the road under old trees whose branches trembled with rain. A long gravel drive wound to a courtyard where lights burned soft. Rosa met us at the threshold, Rosa with a voice like warm bread and hands that folded themselves into the pockets of the apron she wore.
She had the authority of someone who had been the house for a decade or more. She had the look of someone who knew which plates broke on purpose and which ones were accidents. "This is Miss Clark?" Rosa asked, and in that one question there was a quick assessment of whether I was hurt, whether I knew how to walk in the house like it belonged to me. I was a stranger being asked if I fit into the pattern of life she ran. "Yes," Dante said. "This is Maya." Rosa's eyes flicked to me with an inventory. She took my shawl without a word and guided me into a parlor that smelled of lemon and old books. There were rugs that swallowed sound and a vase with late peonies. The house had corners that looked familiarly human, a book left open on a side table, a tray of grapefruit halves, and a small stack of newspapers that had been chosen by hand. But there was also a room in the center, a study, with a door of dark wood that seemed to keep something inside, and as Rosa left, she closed that door softly and walked away like she had been taught to close the world gently around certain rooms. "You're safe here," Dante said. It landed on the furniture like a thrown blanket, heavy, insufficient, and oddly intimate. The first night I slept on a bed that had been turned down in anticipation, like someone had expected my arrival weeks ago. There was lavender in the linen.
There were books at hand about crimes and poets, and an old photograph on the nightstand of a woman with an arm around a young man in a suit who was not Dante. I woke in the middle of the night, and the house hummed with a silence that was its own kind of surveillance. The windows were black mirrors. I think that's when the idea of monitors first settled in the back of my mind, not because I'd seen them, but because the hush made me aware of the possibility of being watched without my consent. The next morning, Marco offered me coffee as if we were old acquaintances, and I was surprised to find his hands kind. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice had the cadence of someone who had been given orders and made those orders humane. "Mr. Moretti says you have questions," he said. "We can answer what we are allowed to." "What are you allowed to tell me?" I asked. He gave a small, almost embarrassed half smile. "He wants to be honest," he said, as if setting the table for a confession. "But he also wants to make sure whatever he says won't make things worse." This is the peculiarity of men like Dante. They attempt to legislate truth. They decide when honesty can occur and in what language. There is a sort of arrogance in placing conditions on confession, and there is also a kind of fear. In Dante's case, the fear seemed colliding with anabolism, his life built around walls and watchfulness that had been erected to stop a repeating geography of loss. After breakfast, he led me through the house, each room more selected than the previous, until we stopped in the study. The door had a lock that clicked, and Dante left the key in his pocket, as if the sound still belonged to him. Inside, a bank of monitors lined one wall like an altar. They were not cinematic displays of movies or artful video. They were small, blown-up frames of parking lots, faces at other tables, the trees outside the ballroom last night. There were clips of a man putting a camera under a gutter, and another of a car's license plate, frozen and magnified. "You set this up to watch me?" I asked, throat tight. "I set it up because I suspected someone had eyes on you," he said, "because you are a person who draws attention, because my reasons are what they are." He would not say mother yet, but there was a manner of dark orbiting the word, an old grief that made his hands clench. He did not try to argue the ethics. When I asked why it had been necessary to put cameras on the streets that had glimpsed me, he simply said, "Because people die in the spaces between seeing and acting." There is a difference between surveillance you agree to, like a babysitter watching a sleeping child, and surveillance that envelops your life without your knowledge. I, who had been watched for years by magazines and cameras, had never been watched by someone who chose to frame my life as a thread to be protected or restrained. I felt stripped in a new way. My choices had been reduced by a gaze I had not consented to. "You recorded me," I said. "You have footage of my life, of where I shop, where I dine. Did you follow me? How long have you been watching?" "It depends," Dante answered, "on the threat, on the posture of those who might hurt you. Sometimes months, sometimes weeks." "It was my right to know," I said, feeling anger like a bright knife beneath the skin, "to consent." He was quiet. For a beat, the rain outside sounded like someone turning a page. "We can set rules," I said. If you're going to do this, it's not on your terms alone." He studied me with an intensity that made the room thin. "What rules?" he asked. I named them, and I surprised myself with how precise I sounded. "No monitoring without my permission. I have to be able to leave when I choose. I need to be able to work. Do you understand what I mean? To keep a life that isn't just your house. And I want full transparency.
No secrets about what you've done in my name, Dante. If I'm going to exist in the orbit of whatever you've built, I need to know what made it and how much of it is your history." There was a moment when I saw the flicker cross his features that was not calculation, but something like fear. He swallowed. "Those are fair," he said, "but I need a week, 1 week to remove immediate danger. You saw what happened at the valet. If something is following you tonight, I need to have a way to make sure it fails." Fails how? The word tasted dangerous even to ask. "Fails by being found out first," he said, "by making sure the people who want to hurt you are identified and made visible. For that, I need access to certain resources. Cameras, people who can trace a license plate. I will not hide anything from you. I will tell you what we uncover. I will not watch you without asking you first." It was the closest thing to a concession he had made. Words like "I will not watch you without asking" sounded like a treaty written between two war-scarred sides. There was a tentative balance forming, my demand for agency and his demand for efficacy. I named one more condition, and when I did, the room changed shape. If in this week you use violence in my name, if you commit crimes and then keep them as if they are proof of love, then this is over. I don't move forward with someone who drapes brutality in the language of protection. He laughed softly, a sound that had sting embedded in it. "Do you think I don't already know that?" He explained then, not all at once, but in pieces over a meal where the food tasted intentionally like childhood and the coffee like a ritual. He spoke of his mother, without the warmth of many son memories. He said her name as an ache. It hung like a photograph on a wall. Someone had killed her while she stood at a bus stop years ago, he said.
The memory had left him with a sense that the world could take people with a small, quiet efficiency, and that the legal world sometimes shrugged and moved on. He had begun, he said, to build systems that could make the people who hurt others seen, to drag them under a magnifying light into consequence. "I didn't set out to be a judge," he said. "I set out to be someone who made sure the right people were watched. But the line is thin. Sometimes you watch, and then you intercept, and then you take responsibility for the intercept, and it changes you." He did not try to sanitize what he had done. He told me about men he had sent abroad with instructions to disappear, about threats that had sometimes been answered by people who were not the law. He told me about being awake at nights, imagining the faces of the people who hurt others, and the small satisfaction of thinking he had made them visible. There was a moral cost in his telling. He told it not as confession to absolve himself, but as catalog to explain the force behind his control. He wanted me to understand that his insistence on a week was not just for my safety, it was for his need to fix what had no legal remedy. He wanted me to see the architecture he had built out of fear. The house accepted him the way a room absorbs a perfume, quietly, completely. Rosa moved through the kitchen without question. Marco closed doors. The jewel of a mansion quality of it disappeared with the revelation that this was not only a home, but a hub. There were secure rooms I didn't see yet, but I knew they existed because of the way the staff moved, carefully, with lives folded into checklists. I insisted on conditions out loud. He accepted them with words that felt like bargaining. "No monitoring without consent. You will have a job if you want it. You will have full access to what you need to know. 1 week. He held up his hand, and there was a softness in it that didn't belong to his public fierceness. "If at any point you feel violated by my methods, you tell me and you go," he said. "But know this, if you leave tonight, they will keep watching you. They may choose to act. It is odd to bargain with someone who carries danger in his shadow. It feels like learning to speak with a predator and asking him for mercy in the grammar of your own survival." There was an intimacy to our negotiation, an intimacy born of the fact that each of us had to trade something. He traded a little control for the possibility of knowing I'd choose him without coercion. I traded a week of my autonomy for the possibility of peace. It felt like walking a narrow bridge with a storm under it. The week began like most things that become shape. Small acts of kindness shivered between larger, darker currents. Dante would come into the sitting room at odd hours to ask me how I slept. He'd make coffee the way someone who never let another in would suddenly make it, as if he had been taught to. Once Marco put a plate of lemon cake on the table without asking, and his movement said he knew how to cut the cake without making it public, an act of service that had a private intention. There were gestures that softened him in public, and ones that hardened him in private. He would stand at the large windows on cold afternoons and watch the rain follow the trajectory it wanted, and then say in a voice that was fraying toward tenderness, "I wish I could erase everything that scared you." "I don't want erasure," I told him. "I want honesty, and I want the choice to leave." We set times to speak, a morning where he'd fill me in on what they'd learned about the Watchers, a late hour where he'd tell me stories that had nothing to do with surveillance, petty things that made him human, a dog he had trained to sit for treats, a garden he maintained because it was the only thing he could control without consequences. He told me about the woman in the photograph, his mother, about how she liked to bake, and how her hands shook when she was trying to be anything like a proper hostess. He never asked me to forgive him, but he showed glimpses that were meant to soften the edges. One afternoon, as if to prove there were real threats outside our constructed bubble, Marco returned from the gate wadded with controlled tension. He didn't look at me at first. He handed Dante a note with one finger, like he was giving over something fragile. "Someone was at the gate," Marco said, finally. His voice was steady, but the muscles at his throat loosened like a harp string. "A black car. 2 men asked questions about the guest list. They were gone before I arrived, but they left a mark on the road. Tire grooves." Dante's face hardened. They were too careful to be random. He turned to me. "This is why I asked for a week. It is not paranoia, it is leverage. It is proof that the world you step into is not simply polished silver." I felt the floor tilt. It was the validation of his claims and the evidence of the danger I had signed up for, a danger that was being borne not just by him, but by the people who served him, and now by me. The house that had felt like an elegant refuge grew a little colder, like a room that had been forced to make space for an argument it never wanted to host. "Do you want me to stay?" I asked, the question brittle and necessary. He looked at me like someone trying to measure the weight of an answer. "I want you to stay," he said, "because if you leave, you will be at risk, and I will be haunted by it. And because I want to see if what we have is enough for you to choose me without coercion. I want to know that I can change the thing I have become for your sake." His words carried with them the possibility of change and the weight of accusation. He wanted absolution because he feared losing me, and he wanted to prove he could be other than the man who built walls. It landed raw inside me, not as a prideful vindication, but as a test.
Could a week do the work of a season? Could someone whose life was constructed out of secrecy learn to let a person inside on terms that removed the power of fear as leverage? Rosa, who had presence like an older sister, told me one evening as she wiped the counters, "He's not as kind as he seems, Miss Clark. But kindness and danger sometimes live in the same houses. That is the odd thing of people." She said it like a warning and a prayer. "Does he deserve redemption?" I asked, because the question had been occupying me in thin, unbearable ways. Rosa folded the towel with a methodical tenderness. "Who ends up deserving what, my dear? People do not get redemption because they pay for it with their sins. They get it when they begin to pay for their sins with things that look like courage. Mr. Moretti has no guarantee. He will have to earn one." The week became a measured instrument, days logged with small agreements, nights that grew taut with closeness when we spoke about things that weren't dangerous. We walked in the garden, and he would point to a tree he had planted and tell me the story of a storm that had bent it but not broken it. He had the reflex of someone who fixed things by building support around them, stiff stakes in the soil, rope tied with care. I thought about the parallel, Dante building supports around people as a way to keep them from being broken. At the same time, there was a ledger of offense that grew like lichen. He confessed to acts that blurred the line between protection and crime, movements that put him on the wrong side of the law. He did not ask me to make him good. He asked me to let him attempt to be better. It is tempting in stories like these to let the woman be dazzled by transformation. It would be easy to paint the scene as one where his darkness is softened away like a bright smear in water. But the truth is more granular. He made offers and then regretted them in the same breath. He would promise to ask before surveillance and then find reasons it was necessary to do otherwise. He would tell stories of searching for men who had erased his mother and then say, "I could tell you what I did, but I can't promise it won't make you leave." "You can't bargain me to forgiveness," I said, one night when his confessions tasted like ash. "If you want me, earn it, yes, but don't come to me with your darkness like a bouquet and expect me to love the thorns." He listened like a man learning to hear new rules.
"Then tell me what doesn't make you leave," he said. And I told him, respect for the rules, the right to work in a place of my choosing, a limit on secrecy. I did not expect him to all at once transform. I expected progress and failure in equal measure. The days of the week passed with the measured violence that comes from habit. We argued about surveillance, when it had been used, when it had become an instrument of possession.
He answered with glimpses into his childhood, into the rawness that formed him. His mother at the bus stop, a man who didn't find justice the way he thought justice should be found. He wanted to keep people from feeling that hollow surprise of loss. I wanted to be free of being someone he kept, rather than someone he loved. 2 days before the week was to end, a new light flared on Marco's face. He came in from the gate with a doggedness that had nothing to do with the domesticity of the house. "There's movement near the back hedge," he said. "Someone's trying to get the easement right now. They're checking the fence line." Dante's jaw set like a chunk of weathered stone. "Lockdown," he said. The house moved like a living thing. Doors clicked. Rosa clicked the kettle off and moved to higher ground. The staff took positions like people who had rehearsed for a threat that came around every corner. I watched the choreography. These were not polite servants arranging a party. This was a household that had trained itself to become a perimeter. We gathered in the study, the monitors flickering with footage culled from the perimeter cameras. The frames were black and white and grainy. A shadow moved past a tree like an animal, and then there was the glimmer of a face at a fence. The intruder was trying corners, testing the gate, likely waiting for a night when the household was less alert. "Who are they?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. I hated that my heart had started to drum like a small animal in my throat. It was an old, involuntary panic, the idea of people in the dark who might choose to end a life carelessly. "Calabresi," Dante said, and the name settled in the room with all the weight of a sealed envelope. "They are a family that never meant to stop existing. They keep histories like trophies." There was a moment when his face changed, and the mask of cultivated indifference slipped. I saw the human beneath the armor, a man who had grieved and then learned to channel that grief into a network of retribution. He stepped closer to the monitors, and for the first time in days I saw something like fear in his eyes, not for himself, though he would take harm without flinching, but for me. The protective instinct in him had teeth. It wanted to close down the world to keep me whole, even if it meant maiming others in the process. He has confessed that he has committed wrongs in the name of protection, yet the fact of that confession did not make the wrongdoing disappear. It demanded real consequences and real choices. I took a breath and thought of the deal we had made. I had asked for 1 week. The week had brought a certain intimacy. Each breath we shared was a negotiation. But the arrival of a named enemy sharpened everything into a blade. We stood on the edge of something that would test whether his promises could stand against the actualizing of his worst impulses. "Lock the gates," Marco ordered quietly. "Alert the local patrol discreetly. We don't make a scene." Dante's hand brushed mine, a fractional touch in the flurry. "You can still leave," he said, "even now. If you decide this is not what you want, I will have you escorted." I could have made a decision right then, walk out into the rain and the city and whatever watchers waited there, or stay in a house that kept secrets in its chest and promised to keep me in its walls. There is no romance in such moments. There is only the calculus of risk and desire. I had to decide, and whatever I chose would not be a clean choice. It would be stained by fear and by longing, and by the knowledge that sometimes people who want to protect have learned protection as the only language of love. I looked at Dante, the man who wanted to protect like a cage maker, the man who had opened his monitors like a confession, the man who had told me about his mother and the way the world had failed her. For reasons that felt both stupid and profound, I chose to stay. "All right," I said, "but remember the rules." He bowed his head, not in deference, but in a quiet acknowledgement that this was a pact between two flawed people. "I will keep them," he said. The phone at the edge of the desk buzzed. Marco answered, and the room tightened. Dante turned the monitors toward me, hands steady enough to be dangerous now. The grainy camera showed a car at the end of the drive, one I'd not seen before, its lights cutting the darkness like 2 white sighs. 2 figures stepped out and lingered under the trees, not yet crossing the lawn, but close enough that a person could imagine them finding their way within. Dante's fingers curled around the desk as he stood up. "Stay in the study," he said. "Don't go out." I felt the air around me constrict, like the breath before a plunge.
His voice carried the authority of a man used to being obeyed. I obeyed because fear is efficient, and because the alternative sometimes tastes like a future I do not yet have the right to imagine. The door clicked behind him, and Marco moved with an economy that suggested he knew his orders would be to be lethal if that was what was needed. Rosa stood by the sideboard, her face an epitaph of calm. The monitors retrieved images, a man with too neat hair checking the lock, another with a hand in his pocket that could be anything, a phone or something else. From the corner, the rain beat a cadence that felt very alarmingly like fate. I sat and watched them appear as shapes in pixels, and thought about the way this life had begun with a dinner and a glittering room, and then had folded inward toward an unknown center of danger. I thought about the negotiation we had made on the couch, the list of conditions, the name Dante had whispered like confession, and the way he had offered me a week like an attempt at redemption.
Somewhere deep in my chest, the question that had been forming ever since the valet had closed like a gate on my options hardened into a stone. Who was I to him? A symbol he could protect? A piece to be held like something precious? Or a person who could demand terms of love and safety? The monitors tracked the shadows growing longer. The house exhaled. The key in Dante's pocket felt like a promise and a threat, and a whole tangled map of a life I had agreed to step into. When the knock came at the front door, 3 short, practiced beats, it sounded like a punctuation mark on all the things that had already been said and not said. My stomach tightened. This could be a neighbor, or a policeman, or a man with a grudge. It could be the beginning of proving the watcher's intent, or it could be the thing that ends whatever naive hope I'd carried out into a house that was not entirely innocent. In the study, where the monitors threw up the image of the gate and the black car and 2 men under umbrellas like dark commas, Marco moved to the door and Dante to the window. My breath stuttered. The air felt wired with something that could snap in either direction, a violence and a tenderness that had both been allowed into the same rooms. I realized with a clarity that felt like The knock at the front door was small and ordinary, 3 short, practiced beats, but in that house it sounded like a verdict. For a second, I couldn't tell whether my chest was responding to the sound or to the cadence of the rain outside, which had turned into a steady, insistent drum. The monitors in the study showed the lawn in grainy slices. Men moved through trees like bad shadows. Dante had disappeared from the desk, and when the footfall on the stairs told me he was leaving the study, the house took a deeper breath, like a thing that needed to steel itself. "Stay," he told me, without looking back. It wasn't a command this time. It was the translation of something older, fear and care braided into one strand. It was, terrifyingly, the way people say a promise when there is no other language. I sat where I had been sitting and watched the door on the monitors, my fingers twisting at the hem of the dress I had not meant to wear again after that night. It felt absurd, this outfit that had once been armor for champagne, now a ridiculous uniform for negotiation. I had meant to put a small, soft note to the camera earlier. If you love dark, forbidden romances, like and subscribe, because even in the edges of my life there was a recognition that people follow this kind of story. But the world had narrowed to the size of the room and the people moving through the trees, and such small theatrics felt improperly timed. The click of heels on stone was louder than any marketing aside. Marco moved like a man who understood lethal choreography. He checked the bolt, the peephole, his face a practiced calm.
Rosa's hands were steady as she poured hot tea into a cup and set it down as if ceremony could staunch the mouth of the world. The front door opened. A man in a raincoat leaned in with 2 policemen whose flashlights cut white bars through fog. My heart stuttered against the ribs. The policemen had the deliberate patience of men who had been called to many quiet things and now had to pretend their training made the world less odd. They asked Dante questions I couldn't hear, their breath visible in the colder air that came through the open door. He answered as if the words had been rehearsed. There was something in his face, an exacting calm that suggested he had staged many answers before. He let the officers sweep the gate and the drive. Marco closed the door behind them again. "We have pictures of a car that doesn't belong to the neighborhood registry," one of the officers said, folding his hands on his belt. "We traced a plate to an anonymous shell. You have the right to call us at any time, sir." He didn't look at me more than a glance. Professional boundaries kept him from registering the strange geometry of my life. Dante said, "We have no desire for a scene. I will be providing you with footage. If you need anything else, you will contact me." The officer nodded, perhaps because men who spoke the language of resources seemed like useful informants.
After they left, there was a tug at the air in the room, like someone had opened a window and not yet closed it. Dante came back to the monitors and switched them off, one by one. The study turned dark and felt suddenly like collapse, like the house had closed its eyes and was trying to remember how to breathe. "You're okay?" he asked, and the voice had a new fragility. "I'm here," I said. "Good." He sat on the edge of the desk and looked at me like someone who had finally allowed himself to belong to an answer he had not been sure he'd have. We intercepted them before they crossed the line. Our gates picked up the movement before they could deploy someone into the yard. They were testing for a night when the staff would be thin. "The officers were talking about anonymous shells," I said. "Calabresi?" He ducked his head a fraction. There was a flash of something that could have been sorrow or rage or both. "Yes," he said. "They have resources. They also have a score to settle. They are not theoretical threats." We sat for a long minute without speaking. Outside, the rain leaned into the trees like a question asked again and again without answers. "Do you regret bringing me here?" I asked finally, because there are times when the only honest question is the simplest one. He did not close his eyes or look away. Dante frowned as if puzzling with the expression. "Sometimes. Not in the sentimental way. Sometimes I regret that I didn't build better walls that didn't need to be sealed with blood. Sometimes I regret that building them made me forget how to ask anyone in."
He touched the scar at his jaw in a motion that was almost a child's fidget. "But I don't regret trying to keep you safe." The first night after that was restless, not because of anything the house did, but because now the house felt like a ledger. We had watched through grainy frames as men in black had plotted and then backed away. The fact that they had been turned off did not make the memory less real, it only made it a problem with edges. Whatever had happened had chosen our house because it knew that something of value, me, sat inside, and that the people who wanted it had ways of persisting. On the second day of the week, Dante invited me to the greenhouse off the east wing. It was a place that smelled of wet earth and green things that had been coaxed into gentleness. The light there was softer, and the garden had an intimacy the rest of the house didn't. He held out a cup of tea, and we sat at a table as if we were strangers who had accepted the awkwardness of small talk. "We need to talk about what happens if my actions hurt more than help," he said, and the way he said it made the leaves around us stir as if the plants were listening. "You know I can't tolerate brutality disguised as protection," I said. "You know my condition. I will not stay if you use someone else's life as a ledger against mine. If you hurt people without consequence, I leave. It's simple." "It isn't simple," he said. "Not once you live in a world where people you care for are eaten by indifference. But I hear you. I want to change how I do things. I don't want to be the person who thinks fear is the only instrument." "How do you change?" I asked. "What does that look like for you? You can't simply switch from one way to another without a plan." He searched the table like a man looking for a map he didn't want to misread. "I'm going to speak to a lawyer," he said, "an independent one. I'm going to start handing over documentation of what we find, the surveillance, the evidence of threatening people documented by us. I will give them to people who can press charges. I will stop ordering removals. I won't—" He stopped and took a breath. "I won't do things because the law is slow. I will trust the law. Maybe not perfectly at first, but I will try." "That's a start," I said. "It's not absolution, but it's a start. I hesitated because the next sentence mattered more than I thought. "I want a job that is mine, not some charity role you give me to make me feel safer. I want independence." He blinked slowly. "I can give you that. We can structure something. A foundation, with a board that is not just me, with accountability. You'd be the director, and we'd set parameters. Audits, transparency, public reporting. You'd be able to say no when I wanted to keep things hidden." I let out a laugh that had a tired edge. "You orchestrate the world, and yet you think a board will keep you honest." He smiled, but the smile was more like a concession than triumph.
"You prefer to think me foolhardy. Good. Then let us have the board." He kept to his word in ways that surprised me. A week after the Gates incident, Marco discreetly handed over a folder to one of the local district attorneys, an ally, Dante said, someone who had been bothered by gray reports before. The DA read through the footage and the ledger, raised questions, and scheduled an intake meeting. It required Dante to sign statements and for his people to lay out how they had acquired certain pieces of evidence. Some of it was damning for the other men. Some of it cast a light on acts Dante had commissioned that technically couldn't be ignored by justice. In choosing to make the shadow visible, he also exposed parts of himself that had previously been private and lethal. I watched him wrestle with it. He was not theatrical about turning himself in. He moved with quiet gravity, as if walking through a simple doorway. The DA wanted to know whether he had used hired men to persuade people to leave, and whether there were bodies he had hidden or counts of coercion that demanded prosecution. "There will be consequences," Dante told me near midnight, the house quiet except for the HVAC's low murmur. "They will go after my funds. They will pull at threads. Calabrese won't like it. There might be retaliation. There will be fingers pointed at me for where the lines blurred." "Are you prepared for that?" I asked. "Prepared to face it instead of doing whatever it takes to close the noise?" "I have to be," he said. "Otherwise, what am I asking of you? For you to be with someone who cheats the world for affection? No. I'll step into the light. We'll let the law take its place. But I'm not naive. The law doesn't hold everyone accountable, and some of the people I've heard won't come back no matter what the courts say." We both knew he would be judged not only by the law but by the ledger of people he'd harmed. I had asked for consequences because I couldn't build a life with someone who hid their hands. When Dante walked into the DA's office 2 days later and gave a statement, I watched him through the study windows. He read from notes that Marco had transcribed and that he had written with a careful hand. He confessed to ordering intimidations, to hiring people to surveil, to acts that started as preventative and crossed into brutality. The DA listened with a face like stone. Justice takes its time, but sometimes it begins with acknowledgement. Dante did not attempt to recast actions as noble. He used the word mistake and the phrase, "I took lives of possibility," in a tone that made me uncomfortable, because goodness needs more than statements to prove itself. Turning oneself in did not erase the past. The days that followed were marked by hearings and phone calls and an appetite in the tabloids that began to gnaw at his public face. The scandal was not over in a week, it began. Still, the process changed the tenor of the house.
Surveillance cameras that had once angled toward the street were documented and cataloged. The monitors in the study were cleared of extraneous feeds. Dante set up a system. Nothing would be viewed that tracked me without a signed consent form. Marco, for all his loyalty, learned to check his impulses against a checklist and to ask permission when he felt compelled to guard beyond his mandate. Calabrese's response was not silence. Men who had no one to answer to are simple to predict and dangerous. They began to push pressure through channels that were not official, through hired thugs, through rumors aimed at my past, through a smear campaign that sought to make me culpable for the violence Dante had once committed. There were threats, offhand slugs of accusation, a package left at the edge of the driveway one night that held a photograph of me, taken through the blinds at a small bakery I'd once frequented in the morning. Marco tracked who had been near the bookshop. Dante made a list of the men who had been in the area. The world outside became an arithmetic of risk. Then, one evening, when the week had dissolved into a month of legal filings, there was violence that could not be confined to paperwork. It was the kind of thing that forces you to choose whether to be an actor in your own life or a spectator. We had returned from a charity lunch. The city was bright and unreasonable, the air thin with late sunlight. The car had not been in motion for 30 seconds when a truck pulled up on the side of the road and another car tried to squeeze in front. The driver braked hard. Someone hurled a rock that struck the passenger window near me. The glass spider-webbed in a precise star and then collapsed inward with a dull pop. We were forced off the road into a side lane where men with faces half hidden tried to surround us. Marco slammed the car into reverse, and a sequence of orders sprang out of him like lightning. The world narrowed to metal and breath and the sound of shoes on pavement. Dante moved like someone who had practiced for this. He opened his door and stood as a kind of shield. "Get down," he told me, and here was the voice that had once been all command. Marco and the driver handled the car. Dante stepped out onto the side lane and met the men who tried to encircle us. One man raised a gun. Marco fired, not at any dramatic target, but at a space that disabled with purpose, all skill and practice. And the gun went off and the man fell. The others scattered like paper in wind. I remember the smell, the clean metallic tang that follows a gunshot, and the way the world snapped into a terrible clarity. Blood, the small bright hush of a broken breath, the heat on the inside of my shirt where shards of glass had brushed my skin. I remember how the men fell back, and Dante's face, in that moment, was an animal's. Everything focused into one point. He did not raise his hands.
He did not deliver a verdict. He moved to the man who lay on the road and checked him, as if the world had narrowed to the single person who had just been hurt. The aftermath was a blur of blue lights and statements and paramedics. The man who had been shot did not die that night, which meant the things that had been done in the name of protection had consequences that could be measured, contained, and prosecuted. Marco was questioned. The officers took statements. Dante sat quietly and let the county's process hum around him. He did not deny that his team had been ready to act. He did not instruct anyone to hush the matter. There would be legal consequences, both for the attackers and for those who had fired. We had insisted on law when it suited us. Now law sat on our shoulders like a patient judge. Days later, when the dust had settled enough for conversation, we spoke on the terrace with rain again gathering at the edges of the sky. The city beneath us had the tentative hush of a place that had been startled but not felled. "I'm sorry," Dante said, in a way that had nothing to do with the other apology he had made in the DA's office. This was smaller, more individual. "I'm sorry you were in that line of sight." I placed my hand over his for a moment and then pulled it away, because the only way to keep yourself intact is sometimes to keep your hands to yourself. "You didn't have to be the thing in the middle," I said. "You could have let the officers arrive." "They weren't timely enough," he said. "Sometimes the law is slow for people who are waiting on it. That is why I acted. I don't say it like a badge, I say it like reality." "Then you must be willing," I said, "to let the law do its work even when it is inconvenient, to step back from the theater of being the only person who can protect. Otherwise you'll always justify." He looked at me, and for the first time I think he was gauging me as what I had asked to be, someone who would not be satisfied with half answers. "I will try," he said. "I will stop picking people off the board of life because I think they won't be caught. I'll turn things over and I'll face the consequences." The days after that were slow and detailed. Dante surrendered certain accounts to investigators. He hired auditors for his foundation funds. He took steps that, to an outsider, looked like self-preservation, but to me were the scaffolding of something like accountability. There were town meetings and angry columns, and somewhere beneath all of it was the grating noise that accompanies a man being judged for the way he had once convinced himself the end justified the means. In the quiet hours when we were not negotiating with the world, we negotiated with each other. I tested his patience with rules. He tested my insistence on autonomy by putting small choices back into my hands.
If he had once been a man who impregnated every room with fear under the banner of protection, he was now making gestures, awkward and sometimes self-sabotaging, toward trust. He asked permission before opening my mail that had been delivered to the house. He slowed down when temptation rose to check cameras without my consent. He asked difficult questions about what accountability looked like, and then listened when I said things about therapy, supervision, and the necessity of external review. We also had the brutal tenderness of human need. Between these negotiations, between the DA's files and the public statements, there were evenings where he sat and read poetry aloud badly because he had never learned to parse it with grace, and there were mornings where he would make me simple toast and butter, as if the small care could unclench a jaw. One night, after a session where he had told me about the last time he had seen his mother's face before she was killed, he put his hand on mine and did not look away. "Tell me what you want," he said. "I want you to keep trying," I said. "Not to be perfect, not to be self-proclaimed selfific, just to try, and to let me be part of how you try." He nodded, and then, with a movement that surprised me, he reached into his jacket and brought out a small velvet box. The gesture felt almost childish, an attempt to make the day look like a scene from a film rather than the granular work of making amends. Inside the box was a key on a fine chain. It was small and simple, a brass key that had been polished like a piece of jewelry. It wasn't ornate. It wasn't an expensive trinket meant to buy forgiveness. It was, as he said when he presented it, a promise with edges. "I was taught to keep doors closed," he whispered, "but doors can be opened in the right time. This key is for you, if you want it. It opens a box where I keep the things I would have hidden, evidence, names, ledgers. It's a symbol, yes, but a real thing. You could choose to lock it, to keep it, or to throw it away." I thought of the weeks we had bartered over rules, and the nights when the house had breathed like a thing in pain. I thought of the DA's office, and the man who had been shot, and the cost of all of it. I thought of Rosa's hands, and Marco's small kindnesses, and the garden where he had told me the story of a storm that bent but did not break a tree. The key on its chain was an invitation and a warning. It was not a claim, it was a choice. "Who keeps the other key?" I asked.
His mouth twisted. "I have another. It's tradition. Or stubbornness. Call it what you want. But I have one on my chain too. We can open it together if you want." I considered all the ways I could take that key. I thought about leaving it in his palm, about throwing it into the garden soil like a seed, about pocketing it as evidence of caution. Then I took it in my hand and felt the cold, familiar weight of metal, and I put the chain around my neck. "I keep it," I said.
"But not because I belong to you. I keep it because I want to be able to open the box when I choose." He watched me with something like relief, an honest, almost embarrassed relief, as if he had been rehearsing for a small catastrophe and I had decided to give him the benefit of failure. "Then we will call it a partnership," he said, "not ownership." The key became an emblem we returned to again and again. I wore it when I went to hearings. I checked it like a talisman when I had to go on the record about the narrow calculus of danger and love. Life did not become sumptuous or simple because I wore it. There were still nights when men in the dark came too close, and times when I would wake hearing the drip of rain and think of the veil between being seen and being taken. But there was also a movement toward honesty. Dante would share the list of people he had asked Marco to watch. He would show receipts and logs, and sometimes, awkwardly, the file where he described the rationales for his earlier choices. There were consequences, and Dante accepted some of them. Calabrese retaliated by hitting some of his businesses, by pulling strings that punctured a few of his investments. The tabloids picked at the wounds as if they were doing the world a public service. The DA opened an inquiry that lasted months, and through it Dante's empire was examined and critiqued. Men who had been protected in the shadows came forward with accusations, and the truth of those allegations could not be erased by a key necklace or by good coffee. At one of the hearings, as the DA's office sifted through the material Dante had volunteered and the things we'd found independently, I sat in a folding chair and watched him answer questions that forced him to be precise about the line he had crossed. He did not cower. He did not preen. He admitted mistakes. He asked for the chance to do the difficult work of restitution, whatever that would mean in the legal frame. It was not a clean redemption. It was a man subject to public scrutiny and the slow machinations of justice. As the months unfurled, an odd thing happened. People began to see me not only as the socialite who had vanished with a forbidden lover, but as someone who had the nerve to insist on terms. The press could not resist a narrative arc that promised scandal and then offered atonement. Interviews came where I refused to be dramatic. I refused the trick of the performance. I said simple things, that I had been frightened, that Dante had done wrong, that he had, in turn, attempted to fix things, and that it was my right to decide whether the man I loved could also be a man I trusted. Love in this house did not look like it does in novels. It was a thing that required negotiation rather than surrender. It was small favors and large confessions. It was a man who showed me how to ask for the truth and then had the courage to answer. It was a woman who kept a key and used it to open the box only when she chose.
One night, after a hearing where the DA had recommended some charges and declined others, Dante and I sat on the roof terrace and watched the rain that had always arrived like a promise. The city glowed below us in a soft, restless light. "You could leave," he said quietly. It wasn't a threat. It was a mercy. "I could," I answered. "But I don't want to run from the consequences to be with you. I want to be here because I choose to, not because I'm hiding." He took my hand. "Then stay. But stay knowing that I'm not fixed. I will keep making amends. I will keep my promises. I will keep trying to do better. And if you fail, then you leave," he said. "I deserve no less." We kissed then, slowly and without pretense. The kiss was not a sealing of wounds. It was an agreement, a small covenant we made with breath and skin. We did not pretend the world would become merciful because two people decided to like each other, but we both wanted, with an astonishing and ordinary stubbornness, to see if we could live within the messy truth of who we were. Months later, there was an official decision in some cases. Jail terms for a few who had been proven to have used violence in Calabrese's orbit, penalties for a company that had been laundering influence, and, most painfully for Dante, public condemnation and legal restrictions that touched his businesses. He paid fines, lost contracts, and had to sell assets he had once considered untouchable. He accepted these costs with a blunt, practiced acceptance. He did not make speeches.
He made arrangements to make right where possible. I moved into the quieter life I had insisted upon. The foundation we created, an entity with a board that included an independent chair and financial audits, gave me work that was not a vanity project. It was messy, slow, and necessary. We assisted families who had been victims of crimes, we built programs for survivors, and we set up an independent review panel that could lean into the kind of accountability I had demanded. It was the kind of work that sometimes yielded small victories and often required patience. Within it, I discovered a different kind of satisfaction, the knowledge that my hands were doing something that mattered outside of my social silhouette. Rosa stayed, of course. Marco remained, though his edge smoothed further as he learned to channel his loyalties into safer corners. The house grew less like a fortress and more like a place where people could take their shoes off and speak in frankness. There were scars that remained, on Dante's face and on our records, on the pages of law and the minds of the people we had affected. There were nights when the city threw rain in sheets, and I would lie awake and count the hours in the way a person counts heartbeats after a long run. The key never left my neck.
Sometimes I would touch it on the train or at a gala, and the movement would anchor me to the truth that I had not only been saved from danger, but had also been bought and then liberated with the currency of consent. There is no perfect way to explain the sensation of being loved by someone who once tried to own you. It is a continual negotiation, a labor of trust, a series of small choices made and remade. Once in the garden, Rosa told me without preamble, "You took something that could have been poison and made it into a medicine." She said it like a woman who had seen many things and liked to call the world by its practical names. "Maybe," I said, "or maybe we simply learned to be honest about what it cost." She nodded. Honesty is not for free. Even as the world made demands of Dante, as the press wrote the arc of our lives in neat columns, and as the legal system picked through the gray, the fact remained that we had begun with an elegant dinner and left with a forbidden lover. But the clause that made that image scandalous, that he had claimed me as though I were a prize, had been linguistically revised into something else. We had rewritten the phrase into a negotiation, a socialite who went to an elegant dinner and left with a man she could choose to stay with, under her terms, not his. On the anniversary of the night we first met, 2 winters and 1 long, hard season later, there was a small gathering at the house. It was not an ostentatious party. It was a modest meal with people who loved us in spite of the messy ledger. We stood on the terrace as rain washed the city into a watercolor sheen. Dante had a cigarette and a look in his eyes that was both the old man's hardness and a soft domestic tenderness I had witnessed in odd hours. "You changed a little," he said. "So did you," I answered. "You don't leave the room with the lights on like you used to." He laughed, a short, private sound. "I have fewer lights to leave on." He took my hand then and slid something across the table toward me, a new key, this one smaller, less ornate. "One for the other things," he said, "for the new boxes we open as partners, for the places where we mean what we say." I took it and felt the cold metal against warm skin, and I kept both keys on the same chain. They did not cancel each other out. They were reminders of my right to open or refuse, of his capacity to ask and to be judged, of the fact that love is not the abolition of consequences, but the willingness to shoulder them together. We did not pretend that our future was unmarked by danger. Calabresi still existed. Lawyers still had their work, and the city continued to be a place where someone could slide into the wrong light and not come out.
But in the cracks of that world, there was a slow, deliberate promise that we would keep speaking to one another in ways that refused secrecy, that we would give the law the space it needed, and that neither of us would cloak violence in the name of affection again. The final scene, if one must call anything a finale when life keeps demanding edits, was simple and messy, and thus appropriate. I returned to a charity dinner the next year. Same chandeliers, different dress. The city had not forgotten me. The cameras slid like trained animals and found me.
Dante stood at the edge of the ballroom with a look that was not ownership, but accompaniment. He did not step forward to claim me in front of friends or cameras. He stepped forward because this time he was invited. We left together, not in the way gossip would call a disappearance, but in a way that had chosen to accept the public and the private both. He offered me his arm. I took it because I wanted to. Outside, the rain began, as if to mark our small private ritual. Someone took our photograph, and the next morning the headline read exactly what it felt like: the socialite who went to an elegant dinner and left with a forbidden lover. There were footnotes to that headline that no paper could print in full: the months of hearings, the nights of argument, the long work of running programs for people who needed help more than they needed spectacle. There were gestures of accountability and months that tasted of legal coffee and late transcripts. But there was also the small miracle of two people who had once used control to solve fear, learning to trade control for concern. I would not say we were saved. Salvation implies a single act. We were instead working. We were painfully and beautifully continuing. In the end, the key on my neck did not feel like a shackle. It felt like a tool. It was not a symbol that he had the right to own me. It was a symbol that I had the right to open and to close, to give and to keep. In a world where men had learned to knot power like a noose, I had insisted on untangling the rope into something that could be used to fix a ladder. The rain tapered to a hush as we stepped into the night, the city lights like a congregation of small, watchful eyes. Dante took my hand, not to claim me, but to join me in a step forward. We walked beneath umbrellas, two figures moving through a world that had judged and would likely judge again. We have not erased the cost of what had been done. We had together chosen to pay attention to the arithmetic of repair. That, in the end, was the closest thing to love we could promise to one another: to be accountable, to be honest, and to let the other person go if they ever asked. The socialite who went to an elegant dinner did leave that night. She left with a forbidden lover, but she also left with keys, with conditions, and with a job that belonged to her.
She left with the hard knowledge that love does not excuse wrongdoing, but it can demand better. And she left with the choice to stay every single day, because staying had to be her decision and not the consequence of fear. If you found this story compelling, subscribe and watch more tales like this, where danger and longing meet, and the cost of love is paid with truth.